In the hushed theater of a Fairfax County courtroom, defendant Isabella Sterling projected an aura of untouchable confidence, her serene smile a chilling counterpoint to the brutal murder charge she faced. With a meticulously crafted alibi and a case built on circumstantial threads, her acquittal seemed all but certain, a testament to her calculated genius. Yet the most damning witness was one no one expected to hear from, and the victim's own voice, captured in a final, desperate call, would become the ghost in the machine of justice, exposing the monster hiding behind the smile. The autumn air in Great Falls, Virginia, had turned crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves through the affluent, tree-lined streets. It was here, in a glass-walled mansion overlooking the Potomac River, that Julian Croft had built an empire from code and ambition, a life of quiet success known only to his inner circle. That life ended abruptly on a Tuesday in October, not with a dramatic struggle, but with a silence that was itself a form of violence. His body was discovered by his sister, Clara, who arrived for their weekly dinner to find the front door unlocked and the house filled with an unnerving stillness. Julian Croft was 42 years old, a brilliant software architect who had recently sold his data analytics firm for an 8-figure sum, positioning him for a life of comfortable retirement or a new venture. He was methodical and private, a man whose personal world was as carefully curated as the algorithms he designed, making the scene of his death all the more incongruous. He lay in his home office, the victim of a single precise act of violence that left the rest of the room, the neat stacks of books, the gleaming laptop, the framed architectural prints, utterly undisturbed. There was no sign of forced entry, no theft, and no chaos, only the cold, methodical signature of a killer who had been invited in. Clara Croft's initial call to 911 was a choked, disbelieving series of fragments, the sound of a world instantly and irrevocably shattering. She had looked up to her brother her entire life, viewing him as an anchor of logic and stability in a world she often found chaotic. Seeing him so unnaturally still felt like a violation of the laws of nature. The Fairfax County police detectives who arrived found a crime scene that offered few immediate answers, a sterile environment wiped clean of obvious clues. It was a puzzle box, meticulously assembled by a killer who seemed to believe they had created an unsolvable problem, leaving behind only the profound, echoing grief of a family torn apart. The initial investigation centered on Julian's recent business dealings, particularly the lucrative sale of his company, a transaction managed by his sharp-witted and charismatic business partner, Isabella Sterling. To the outside world, their partnership was a perfect fusion of talent. Julian the reclusive genius, Isabella the public-facing visionary who translated his complex ideas into profitable realities. Isabella presented herself to detectives as a woman devastated by the loss of her friend and collaborator, her grief as polished and convincing as her corporate presentations. But beneath the surface of her composed sorrow, detectives sensed a dissonant note, a coolness that felt less like shock and more like the placid confidence of a performer who had just flawlessly delivered her lines. The community reacted with the hushed disbelief common in wealthy enclaves where violence is perceived as an external threat, something that happens elsewhere to other people. Julian was remembered as a generous but intensely private man, his murder a stark tear in the fabric of their manicured reality. Friends and former colleagues spoke of his recent excitement about the future, of his plans to travel and dedicate his time to philanthropic work and education. Every memory shared only deepened the mystery and magnified the profound injustice of his end, a calculated act of darkness that had extinguished a quiet and brilliant light. As detectives began to dig deeper into the sterile crime scene, they started to appreciate the killer's discipline, a quality that pointed away from a crime of passion and towards something far more chilling. The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence, suggesting a perpetrator who knew forensic procedures and had taken deliberate, painstaking steps to erase their presence. This was not a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. This was a personal and flawlessly executed assassination. The killer had left behind nothing but a body and a series of questions, confident that the story they had crafted, a story of tragic, inexplicable loss, would be the only one ever told. Clara Croft became the human anchor for the investigation, her grief a constant, searing reminder of the stakes. She provided detectives with Julian's calendars, his personal emails, and every detail she could recall about his recent conversations and concerns. She spoke of a growing tension between Julian and Isabella, a professional friction he had dismissed as typical business stress, but which, in retrospect, seemed ominous. It was Clara who first planted the seed of doubt, suggesting that the one person who stood to gain the most from Julian's silence was the very partner who was now publicly mourning his death. The medical examiner's report confirmed the detective's suspicions. The cause of death was a lethal injection of a rare, fast-acting paralytic agent, a substance incredibly difficult to trace and nearly impossible to obtain without specialized medical or chemical knowledge. This revelation transformed the case, elevating it from a potential domestic dispute to a premeditated murder of extraordinary sophistication. The killer wasn't just ruthless. They were highly intelligent, patient, and methodical, and as detectives cross-referenced this profile with the list of people in Julian's life, one name kept rising to the surface with unsettling consistency: Isabella Sterling. 2 weeks after the discovery of Julian Croft's body, the circumstantial evidence had coalesced into a tight, suffocating net around Isabella Sterling. A forensic accounting team had uncovered a shadow ledger within the company's servers, revealing that Isabella had been systematically embezzling funds for over a year, diverting nearly $3 million into offshore accounts. Julian, a man meticulous with numbers, had discovered the discrepancy just 4 days before his death with a recovered, deleted calendar entry showing a scheduled meeting with his attorneys titled Partnership Breach. The motive was no longer theoretical. It was documented in cold, hard numbers. The arrest took place not in a dramatic standoff, but in the sterile, white lobby of Isabella's luxury condominium in Reston. 2 plainclothes detectives approached her as she returned from her morning run, her expression shifting not to fear or surprise, but to a look of mild, intellectual annoyance, as if they were tardy employees arriving late for a meeting. She listened to the charges against her with an unnerving placidity, her breathing steady, her posture perfect. Her only request was to be allowed to retrieve her blazer, a gesture of control and a quiet insistence on maintaining her polished image even as her world was about to be publicly dismantled. In the interrogation room at the Fairfax County Adult Detention Center, Isabella's composure became a form of psychological warfare. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly on the metal table, and regarded the 2 seasoned detectives with an air of detached amusement. She waived her right to an attorney, an act of supreme arrogance that told the investigators everything they needed to know about her mindset. She believed she was intellectually superior to everyone in the room, and that this interview was not a legal peril, but a game of wits. She was destined to win. "I understand that you have a job to do, detectives," she began, her voice smooth and measured, "but you have made a grave error. Julian was my partner and my friend. The idea that I would harm him is not just baseless, it's frankly absurd." She spoke about the financial allegations with a condescending wave of her hand, dismissing them as a complex misunderstanding, a series of clerical errors that Julian himself was helping her resolve. She constructed her narrative with the precision of an architect, each word a carefully placed brick in the fortress of her innocence, a fortress she believed was impenetrable. The detectives presented her with the cell phone data, records that placed her device within a 1-mile radius of Julian's home at the estimated time of his murder, directly contradicting her alibi that she had been at a secluded yoga retreat in the Shenandoah Valley. Isabella didn't flinch. She simply smiled, a thin, knowing smile that grated on the nerves. "Signal triangulation is a notoriously inexact science," she countered, her tone that of a patient teacher explaining a difficult concept to a slow student. "A good attorney will demonstrate that in about 5 minutes you have nothing." For hours they questioned her, and for hours she remained a placid lake of denial. Her story never wavered, her calm never broke. She answered questions with questions, parried accusations with technical jargon, and consistently portrayed herself as the true victim, a grieving friend now being harassed by an incompetent police force. Her performance was flawless, a chilling display of narcissistic control. She wasn't just denying the crime, she was expressing a profound, almost philosophical disdain for the very idea that she could be held accountable for her actions. The interrogation ended not with a confession, but with a stalemate. Isabella sat back in her chair, the knowing smile returning to her face as the detectives gathered their files. "Are we finished?" she asked, her voice laced with a triumphant boredom. I have a business to run, and this has been a tremendous waste of my time." It was clear to everyone involved that this case would not be resolved in the confines of an interrogation room. It would have to be fought in a courtroom where Isabella's unshakable confidence would be pitted against a mountain of indirect yet damning evidence. As she was led to her cell to await arraignment, Isabella showed no fear or despair. Instead, she seemed to carry an air of grim satisfaction, as if this were all part of her grand intellectual exercise. She had built what she believed to be the perfect crime, followed by the perfect denial, and now she would mount the perfect defense. She did not see the bars of a jail cell. She saw the opening moves of a chess game against a lesser opponent, a game she had no doubt she would win. The system, she was convinced, was just another set of rules to be manipulated and overcome. With Isabella Sterling formally charged with first-degree murder, the case fell to Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney Elias Vance, a methodical and unassuming prosecutor known for his ability to weave complex circumstantial evidence into an unbreakable narrative. Vance knew from the outset that this would be the most challenging case of his career. He had no murder weapon, no confession, and no eyewitnesses, only a collection of digital breadcrumbs and a powerful motive against a defendant whose intelligence was matched only by her profound arrogance. Vance's team began the arduous process of assembling their case, brick by painstaking brick. They meticulously documented the flow of embezzled money from the company's accounts to the labyrinth of shell corporations Isabella had creating a visual timeline that showed the thefts escalating as Julian grew closer to discovering them. They brought in digital forensics experts who had recovered fragments of a damning email from Julian's server, a draft addressed to Isabella in which he wrote, "I know what you've been doing. We need to talk to the authorities." The email was never sent, but its existence was a ghost of the confrontation that likely led to his murder. The prosecution's theory was clear. Isabella was a classic narcissist who, when faced with the impending collapse of her empire and public humiliation, chose murder as a calculated business decision. She saw Julian not as a human being but as a problem to be eliminated, a loose end to be tied. Vance's challenge was to make a jury of 12 ordinary citizens see the monster hiding behind Isabella's sophisticated and composed facade, to convince them that the absence of overt emotion was not a sign of innocence, but a symptom of a profound and dangerous pathology. Meanwhile, Isabella secured the services of Marcus Thorne, one of Virginia's most prominent and expensive defense attorneys. Thorne was a master of creating reasonable doubt, a legal tactician renowned for his ability to dismantle circumstantial cases by finding the single weak thread that could unravel the entire tapestry. He reviewed the prosecution's evidence and saw exactly what he expected, a case built on inference and assumption. There was no direct link, no piece of physical evidence that placed Isabella Sterling in Julian Croft's office at the moment of his death. Thorne's strategy began to take shape immediately. He would portray Isabella as a brilliant but misunderstood innovator, a woman whose unconventional business methods were being misconstrued as criminal activity by a prosecution desperate to close a high-profile case. He would argue that the financial transactions were not theft but complex, agreed-upon investments that the reclusive Julian had delegated to her. The unsent email, he would contend, was taken out of context, part of a larger heated business debate, not a prelude to murder. His entire defense would hinge on turning the prosecution's greatest weakness, the lack of direct evidence, into his greatest strength. Elias Vance knew what was coming. He anticipated Thorne's every move, preparing counter-arguments for each point of contention. He focused on building a web of evidence so dense and interconnected that no single thread could be broken without affecting the others. The case wasn't about a single gotcha moment, it was about the overwhelming weight of probability. The financial motive, the digital trail, the false alibi, the specialized knowledge of toxins, taken individually, each could be explained away, but taken together, they pointed in only one direction and to only one person. The pre-trial discovery process became a tense battle of legal wits. Thorne filed a flurry of motions to suppress key pieces of evidence, including the financial records and the recovered email fragments, arguing they were obtained through improper warrants. Vance's team worked relentlessly to defend the integrity of the investigation, meticulously documenting every step to ensure it was legally sound. Each motion and countermotion was a skirmish in a much larger war, a fight to define the narrative landscape before the trial even began. The core of the conflict was a philosophical one, a clash between two opposing views of reality. For the prosecution, the confluence of so many incriminating circumstances was a logical impossibility unless Isabella was guilty. It defied the laws of chance. For the defense, the absence of a single irrefutable piece of physical evidence was proof that the state had failed to meet its burden. The courtroom would become the arena where these two interpretations would collide, and 12 jurors would be asked to decide which story was not just plausible, but true beyond a reasonable doubt. In the months leading up to the trial, Isabella Sterling, out on a multi-million-dollar bond secured by her remaining assets, meticulously crafted her public persona. She was no longer just a defendant, she was the protagonist in a drama of her own making, playing the role of a wrongly accused woman facing down the immense power of the state. She attended every pre-trial hearing, dressed in conservative, elegant attire, her expression a carefully calibrated mask of solemn dignity. She was the picture of grace under fire, a performance designed to subtly influence every person in the courtroom, from the judge to the janitorial staff. During these hearings, her interactions with her own attorney, Marcus Thorne, became a source of growing tension. Isabella viewed Thorne not as her advocate, but as a high-priced employee whose function was to execute her strategy. She would pass him notes during the prosecution's arguments, filled not with legal questions, but with critiques of Elias Vance's rhetoric and condescending suggestions for Thorne's cross-examinations. Her confidence was absolute, her belief in her own innocence, or rather, her own untouchability, so profound that it bordered on delusional. Thorne, a veteran of countless high-stakes trials, found himself increasingly unsettled by his client's demeanor. He was accustomed to defendants who were scared, angry, or desperate, but Isabella was none of those things. She seemed to be enjoying the process, drawing a kind of narcissistic sustenance from the attention and the intellectual challenge of the legal battle. The subtle smirks she directed at the prosecution team and the quiet, confident smiles she offered the judge felt less like the actions of an innocent person and more like the taunts of a predator toying with its prey. One of the most critical pre-trial battles was fought over the admissibility of Isabella's personal research history. The prosecution had discovered that in the weeks before Julian's murder, she had used encrypted browsers on a library computer to search for terms like fast-acting paralytic agents, how to defeat coroner toxicology tests, and undetectable poisons. Thorne argued vehemently that this was prejudicial character assassination, claiming Isabella was a voracious reader and amateur novelist researching a fictional thriller. The judge, in a major blow to the defense, ruled that the search history was too specific and too timely to be coincidental, allowing it to be presented to the jury. This ruling was the first crack in the armor of Isabella's carefully constructed defense, but she showed no sign of concern. When Thorne delivered the bad news, she simply nodded, a flicker of disappointment in her eyes that was quickly replaced by renewed resolve. "It changes nothing, Marcus," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "They are just words on a screen. There is no proof of intent. Focus on the alibi. The alibi is perfect." Her faith in her carefully constructed timeline, her supposed stay at the secluded spa, with no cameras or reliable cell service, was absolute. The victim's family, led by Clara Croft, attended every single hearing, their quiet, dignified grief a stark contrast to Isabella's theatrical performance. Clara would sit in the front row of the gallery, her eyes fixed on the woman who had murdered her brother. She never cried or spoke out, but her presence was a powerful, silent testimony to the human cost of the crime. During one hearing, Isabella turned and met Clara's gaze, offering not a look of remorse or pity, but a small, almost imperceptible smile, an act of such profound cruelty that it made even Marcus Thorne's stomach turn. As the trial date approached, the tension between Isabella and her legal team reached a breaking point. Thorne urged her to consider a plea deal, explaining that while their case was strong, a jury could be unpredictable, and a conviction would mean life without parole. Isabella laughed at the suggestion, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "Plead guilty, Marcus. I am innocent," she said, her use of the word a chilling perversion of its meaning. "We are not here to negotiate a surrender, we are here to win. Do your job." Thorne realized then that he was not defending a client, he was enabling a pathology. Isabella's courtroom persona was not an act designed to feign innocence. It was a genuine reflection of her core belief that she was superior, that the rules of society did not apply to her, and that this trial was merely a temporary inconvenience on her path to inevitable victory. The first Monday in June, the trial of the Commonwealth of Virginia Viv. Isabella Sterling commenced in the historic Fairfax County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed, a silent, expectant theater filled with journalists, legal observers, and members of a community captivated by the case's blend of wealth, intellect, and cold-blooded violence. At the center of it all sat Isabella, an island of unnerving calm in a sea of tension, her posture immaculate, her gaze fixed forward, a faint, almost beatific smile playing on her lips as if she were a guest of honor at a tedious but necessary ceremony. In his opening statement, Elias Vance walked slowly toward the jury box, his demeanor somber and deliberate. He painted a portrait of Julian Croft as a brilliant, gentle man on the cusp of a new chapter in his life, a life stolen from him by pure, calculated greed. "This is not a case about a momentary lapse in judgment or a crime of passion," Vance stated, his voice low but resonant. "This is a case about a choice." The defendant, Isabella Sterling, a woman of immense intelligence and privilege, made a choice to murder her partner for $3 million, and she did so with the same cold, detached precision she applied to her business. Vance methodically laid out the roadmap of his circumstantial case, the financial motive, the digital evidence, the incriminating internet searches, and the impossible-to-verify alibi. He never raised his voice, allowing the weight of the facts to create the drama. As he spoke, Isabella watched him with an expression of detached curiosity, occasionally whispering a comment to Marcus Thorne and smiling, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the jurors. Her smile was a declaration of war, a silent message that she was above his accusations and beyond his reach. When it was his turn, Marcus Thorne rose with an air of weary confidence, positioning himself as the lone voice of reason in a storm of prosecutorial speculation. He portrayed Isabella as a visionary entrepreneur, a woman whose success had made her a target for a rushed and biased investigation. "The Commonwealth will present you with a story, a compelling and dramatic story," Thorne argued, gesturing toward the prosecution's table. "But a story is not evidence. What they will not present you with is a single piece of tangible proof that connects Miss Sterling to this terrible crime. Sesturin chef, the tutti, this carry of you ad day." Thorne's strategy was to attack the very foundation of the state's case, framing it as a collection of coincidences and misinterpretations. The financial transfers were complex but legitimate. The internet searches were innocuous research for a novel. The cell phone data was unreliable. He concluded by directing the jury's attention to his client. "Look at her," he urged. "Does this look like a woman capable of such a monstrous act, or does she look like what she is? An innocent person caught in a living nightmare, trusting in our system of justice to find the truth." Throughout both opening statements, Isabella's behavior was a study in controlled audacity. When Vance described the mechanics of the murder, she listened with an academic's interest, as if analyzing a case study. When Thorne proclaimed her innocence, she nodded subtly, her serene smile projecting an unshakable belief in his words. She made direct eye contact with several jurors, and even the judge, each time offering that same faint smile, a gesture that could be interpreted as either the confidence of the innocent or the chilling arrogance of the guilty. The trial had begun, and the central conflict was established. It was not just a battle of evidence and legal theory, but a profound psychological drama. The prosecution's case rested on the idea that the sheer weight of circumstance could overcome the absence of direct proof. The defense's case rested on the presumption of innocence and the performance of its client. And at the heart of it all was Isabella's smile, a silent, constant presence in the courtroom that would either be her shield or the very thing that ultimately condemned her. Elias Vance began weaving his web of circumstantial evidence with the dry but damning testimony of the first witness, the forensic accountant who had untangled Isabella's complex financial fraud. For 2 days, the accountant walked the jury through a labyrinth of spreadsheets and bank statements, tracing the path of the $3 million from the company's operating accounts to offshore entities controlled by Isabella. The testimony was dense and technical, but its conclusion was brutally simple. This was not a misunderstanding, it was a methodical, long-term campaign of theft. Throughout the testimony, Isabella appeared bored, occasionally stifling a delicate yawn, as if the details of her own grand larceny were beneath her. Next, the prosecution called the digital forensics expert from the Fairfax County Police Department. This witness explained how he had recovered deleted data from Julian Croft's laptop, including the draft of the email confronting Isabella about the missing funds. Marcus Thorne's cross-examination was masterful. He forced the expert to concede that there was no way to know if Julian ever intended to send the email or if it was merely the product of a fleeting moment of anger. But the damage was done. The jury had now seen a motive crystallize into a direct confrontation, a confrontation that took place just hours before Julian's murder. Vance then shifted from the technical to the personal, calling a series of former colleagues and employees to the stand. One by one, they painted a consistent portrait of Isabella Sterling, brilliant and charismatic on the surface, but deeply manipulative and utterly ruthless behind the scenes. A former executive assistant tearfully recounted how Isabella had ruined her career over a minor mistake, describing her as a woman who lacked empathy and viewed people as either assets or obstacles. The prosecution's narrative was gaining momentum, each witness adding another thread to the tapestry of guilt. The most impactful testimony of this phase came from the lead detective who detailed Isabella's behavior during her interrogation. He described her chilling calm, her condescending tone, and her absolute refusal to provide a verifiable alibi. Vance concluded the detective's direct examination by asking a simple question: in your 25 years as a homicide detective, have you ever interrogated a suspect in the murder of a close friend who behaved in that manner? After a swift objection from Thorne was overruled, the detective answered, "Never, not once." Thorne fought back fiercely, cross-examining each witness with surgical precision. He suggested the forensic accountant had a confirmation bias, that the digital expert had overstated his findings, and that the former colleagues held personal grudges against a demanding but successful boss. He was chipping away at the edges of the prosecution's case, creating small pockets of doubt, but he could do nothing about his own client's demeanor. Her placid confidence in the face of devastating testimony was undermining his efforts, transforming his carefully crafted defense into a performance with a deeply unbelievable lead actress. The prosecution rested its case after calling the toxicologist who confirmed that the poison used to kill Julian was one of the same rare substances Isabella had researched on the library computer. The final image Vance left with the jury was that of Isabella's search history projected onto a large screen, the cold, clinical terms, "undetectable poisons, time to cardiac arrest," hanging in the air. As the words glowed in the dim courtroom, Isabella looked up at the screen, then at the jury, and offered a small, almost imperceptible shrug, as if to say, "So what?" It was an act of such staggering arrogance that a palpable chill settled over the room. The web was now complete. Elias Vance had constructed a case based not on a single decisive blow, but on the crushing weight of 1,000 interconnected threads. He had shown the jury the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Now, he had also shown them the mind of a killer, a mind so convinced of its own superiority that it could not even feign the basic human emotions of fear or remorse. The prosecution's case was resting, but the most powerful evidence against Isabella Sterling, her own personality, remained on full display. Marcus Thorne knew he faced an uphill battle. The prosecution had successfully painted a portrait of his client as a cold, calculating monster, and Isabella's own courtroom demeanor had done little to dispel that image. His strategy, therefore, was not to make the jury like Isabella, but to make them doubt the evidence. He would construct an alternative narrative built on a foundation of reasonable doubt, a story in which every piece of the prosecution's case could be viewed through a different, more innocent lens. Thorne began his defense by calling a series of expert witnesses to directly challenge the state's forensic evidence. He brought in a renowned telecommunications engineer who testified that cell tower triangulation, especially in a hilly, wooded area like Great Falls, could have a margin of error of several miles, rendering the data that placed Isabella near the crime scene effectively meaningless. Next, he called a forensic psychologist who argued that there is no single uniform way for an innocent person to react to an accusation and that a calm intellectual demeanor under pressure could be a sign of a disciplined mind rather than a guilty one. The centerpiece of the defense's narrative was Isabella's alibi, her claim that she was at the Sanctuary Spa, a highly exclusive and remote wellness retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains, at the time of the murder. The spa had a strict no electronics policy and very few staff, making it the perfect location for a person who either genuinely wanted to disconnect or wanted to create an unverifiable black hole in their timeline. Thorne called the spa's owner to the stand, who testified that while she couldn't specifically recall seeing Isabella on the dates in question, Isabella was a regular client and her reservation had been in the books for months. Thorne worked to build a plausible, if unprovable, narrative around this alibi. He presented evidence of the spa reservation, made 3 months in advance, and a credit card charge for the stay that was processed the day after the murder. Isabella Sterling didn't create an alibi after the fact. Thorne argued to the jury she had a long-standing plan to be exactly where she said she was. The state wants you to believe she is a criminal mastermind, yet their entire case rests on the idea that she was sloppy enough to use her own cell phone near the crime scene. A cell phone that, as our expert testified, could have been miles away from where the prosecution claims. The defense's most challenging task was to reframe the financial evidence. Thorne called a character witness, a respected venture capitalist who had worked with Isabella for years. He testified that Isabella was known for her aggressive and unorthodox financial strategies, but that she was fundamentally honest. He suggested that what the prosecution was calling embezzlement was likely a high-risk, off-the-books investment strategy that she was managing on behalf of the partnership, a strategy the more conservative Julian may have initially misunderstood or disagreed with. Throughout her own defense, Isabella's performance shifted subtly. Under Thorne's careful coaching, her serene smile was replaced by a look of grave, focused attention. She took copious notes, conferred with her attorney in hushed tones, and projected the image of a woman deeply engaged in the fight for her life. It was a masterful pivot, designed to make the jury see her not as an arrogant predator, but as an active participant in her own exoneration. Yet, at key moments, the mask would slip, a flicker of a smirk when her expert dismantled the cell tower data, a look of condescending pity for the prosecution team, reminding anyone watching closely that the underlying personality had not changed. Thorne's final witness was a surprise. He called a disgruntled former employee of Julian's company who had been fired for cause a month before the murder. Thorne elicited testimony that this employee had made vague threats against Julian, attempting to plant the seed of an alternative suspect in the jury's mind. It was a classic defense tactic, creating just enough smoke to suggest there might be a fire elsewhere. Elias Vance, on cross-examination, quickly got the witness to admit his threats were just angry venting and that he had a rock-solid alibi, but the suggestion had been made. As the defense rested its case, the courtroom was left in a state of equipoise. Thorne had successfully introduced doubt. He had provided alternative explanations for the state's evidence and had presented a plausible, if unconfirmed, alibi. He had built a fortress of reasonable doubt around his client, a fortress whose walls were made of expert testimony and alternative theories. The prosecution's web of circumstance, once seemingly ironclad, now appeared to have holes. The trial was poised on a knife's edge, with Isabella Sterling smiling confidently, convinced that the narrative of her innocence had finally triumphed. With the presentation of evidence concluded, the trial moved into its final, emotionally charged phase before closing arguments. It was time for the victim impact statements, a moment for the court to hear not about the clinical details of the crime, but about the human devastation it had left in its wake. The first to speak was Julian Croft's elderly father, who spoke in a frail, trembling voice about his son's kindness and the unbearable silence that now filled his life. Several jurors were visibly moved, dabbing their eyes with tissues as the old man's grief washed over the courtroom. Throughout his heartbreaking testimony, Isabella Sterling remained a statue of composure, her hands folded neatly on the defense table. She listened with an air of polite patience, her expression unchanging. There was no flicker of remorse, no sign of empathy, only the same serene, impenetrable mask she had worn for the entire trial. Her detachment was so profound, so complete, that it seemed to be an act of defiance, a silent refusal to acknowledge the pain she had caused. Then Clara Croft took the stand. Dressed in a simple black dress, she walked with a quiet dignity that commanded the room's attention. She did not speak to the judge or the jury, but turned her body slightly in the witness box to face Isabella directly. "You took my brother from me," she began, her voice steady and clear, devoid of hysteria but filled with a cold, righteous anger. "He was the kindest man I have ever known. He trusted you, he saw you as a friend, a partner, and you repaid that trust by ending his life for money." Clara spoke of the small things she missed, her brother's dry wit, their shared love for old movies, the way he would call her just to share a ridiculous thought that had popped into his head. Her statement was not a plea for justice, but a eulogy, a final desperate attempt to make the woman who had killed her brother see him as a human being. "He had a future," Clara said, her eyes boring into Isabella's. "He had plans, and you erased all of it. I hope that every day for the rest of your life you see his face." As Clara spoke, a stunning and grotesque thing happened. Isabella Sterling, who had remained placid through weeks of damning testimony, listened to this raw, unfiltered grief and began to smile. It was not the faint, confident smile she had offered the jury, but a wider, more pronounced expression, a look of unmistakable condescension and pity. It was the smile of a superior being observing the primitive emotional display of a lesser creature, and it was the most monstrous thing anyone in the courtroom had ever seen. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The jury stared, frozen in disbelief. That smile was the final provocation. It was a bridge too far, an act of psychological cruelty that stripped away any last lingering doubt about the darkness in her heart. For Elias Vance, who had watched the entire trial with a simmering, controlled anger, this was the breaking point. He saw the jury's horrified reaction and knew that in that single, silent moment, Isabella had done more to convict herself than any witness he had put on the stand. He rose to his feet, his face a grim mask of determination. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence, "the Commonwealth had intended to proceed to closing arguments. However, in light of the defendant's shocking and remorseless display, and based on new information that has only just come to our attention, the prosecution requests permission to present one final piece of rebuttal evidence." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Marcus Thorne shot to his feet, objecting furiously. "This is a procedural outrage. The discovery phase is closed. The prosecution is grandstanding." The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. He looked at Vance, his expression severe. "Mr. Vance, this is highly irregular. What is the nature of this evidence?" Vance paused, letting the tension build, his eyes fixed not on the judge, but on Isabella, whose smile had finally faltered, replaced by a look of genuine confusion and a flicker of something she had not shown yet. "It is an audio recording, Your Honor," Vance announced to the silent court. "It is the sound of the victim's final moments. It is the sound of the murder of Julian Croft." The courtroom was thrown into chaos. Marcus Thorne was apoplectic, arguing that the prosecution was ambushing the defense with last-minute unvetted evidence in a desperate attempt to salvage a failing case. He accused Elias Vance of theatrical tricks and professional misconduct, demanding the judge declare a mistrial. The judge, clearly angered by the breach of protocol, sent the jury out of the room and ordered both attorneys into his chambers for a heated, off-the-record conference that lasted for nearly an hour. Inside the judge's chambers, Vance explained the extraordinary circumstances. The evidence was a voicemail, discovered only 48 hours prior. In his final panicked moments, Julian Croft had apparently tried to call 911, but in his terror had misdialed and inadvertently called a random number from his recent call history, a catering company he had contacted for a corporate event weeks earlier. The company's owner, having been out of the country, had only just listened to his old voicemails and upon hearing the horrifying sounds, immediately contacted the police. It was a 1 in a million chance, a fluke of fate that had delivered a voice from beyond the grave. The judge, after listening to the recording in private, made his ruling. He acknowledged the severe procedural irregularity, but deemed the evidence too probative and too critical to the search for truth to be excluded. He would allow the prosecution to play the recording for the jury, but he would also grant the defense a 24-hour continuance to prepare a response. Thorne protested, but the decision was final. The jury was brought back in, their faces etched with curiosity and apprehension. Isabella Sterling sat at the defense table, her mask of composure reassembled, but her eyes betrayed a new, unfamiliar tension. Elias Vance stood before the jury, the gravity of the moment silencing the entire room. For this entire trial, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. You have heard from witnesses who have tried to tell you what happened on the night of October 12th. Now you will hear from the only person who was actually there. You are about to hear the voice of Julian Croft. He nodded to a technician, and a set of large speakers, brought in moments before, crackled to life. A profound and chilling silence fell over the courtroom as everyone leaned forward. The recording began with the sound of a muffled, panicked voice. Please, stop. What are you doing? It was Julian, his voice strained with terror and disbelief. Then came another voice, a woman's, distorted and low but filled with a cold, venomous calm. You should have just let it go, Julian. You should have been smarter. Thorne immediately objected that the female voice was unrecognizable, but the judge ordered the recording to continue. The sounds of a struggle followed. A thud, a gasp for air, the sound of a man fighting for his life. Clara Croft sobbed openly in the gallery, her head buried in her hands. The jurors listened, their faces pale with horror. Isabella Sterling remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the speaker as if it were a physical enemy, her jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle pulsed in her cheek. The audio was a raw, unfiltered document of human terror, a nightmare brought to life in the sterile, formal environment of the courtroom. The struggle on the recording subsided, replaced by the faint, ragged sound of Julian's last breaths. And then, in the suffocating silence that followed, came another sound. It was a clear, distinct, and utterly unmistakable sound, the gentle, melodic chime of an antique German cuckoo clock striking 9 times. As the 9th chime faded into silence, the recording ended. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a collective realization swept through the courtroom like an electric current. Every juror, every journalist, and every observer remembered the testimony from the first week of the trial, the crime scene photos of Julian's ultra-modern home, devoid of any such antique. But they also remembered the detective's description of Isabella Sterling's condo and the defense's own photos of her living room, where a large, ornate cuckoo clock, a family heirloom she had mentioned with pride, was prominently displayed. The sound shattered her alibi completely. Her carefully constructed narrative of being at a remote spa in the mountains was obliterated by a simple 9-second chime. The clock was her prized possession, a unique sound signature that placed her at the scene of the crime as surely as a fingerprint or a strand of DNA. It was her own vanity, her own sentimental attachment to an object that had betrayed her. The perfect crime had been undone by a sound. In the recording, the victim had not only captured his own murder, he had, in his final moments, unknowingly provided the single irrefutable piece of evidence that would identify his killer. The playing of the audio recording was the fatal blow from which the defense could not recover. Marcus Thorne's attempt to argue that the chime was a generic sound, perhaps from a television or radio, fell flat in the face of the prosecution's rebuttal. Vance called back the detective who had searched Isabella's home, who testified that he had personally heard the unique, slightly off-key chime of her antique clock, a sound he described as identical to the one on the recording. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. As the foreperson read the word guilty, a wave of relief and sorrow washed over Clara Croft and her family. But Isabella Sterling's reaction was the most telling moment of the entire trial. There was no outburst, no denial, no tears. Instead, her face for the first time registered an expression of pure, unadulterated shock, not the shock of an innocent person wrongly convicted, but the stunned disbelief of a grand master who has just been checkmated by a novice. Her smile, the weapon and shield she had wielded for months, vanished completely, replaced by a cold, empty void. At the sentencing hearing 1 month later, Isabella appeared a different person. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by a sullen, simmering rage. Her serene mask had shattered, revealing the seething narcissism beneath. She refused to make a statement, staring ahead with a look of profound contempt for the entire process, for the judge, the jury, and the system that had dared to hold her accountable. Her silence was more damning than any confession, a final, petulant act of defiance from a woman who still believed she had done nothing wrong. The judge, a man known for his stoic and measured temperament, removed his glasses and leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Isabella. His voice, when he spoke, was not filled with legal jargon, but with a raw human condemnation. "Sterling," he began, "for weeks you sat in this courtroom and treated these proceedings as a form of entertainment. You smiled at the jury, you smirked at the victim's grieving family, and you projected an aura of superiority that was frankly one of the most chilling displays of inhumanity I have ever witnessed from that chair." He spoke of the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, but emphasized that it was the final recording that had removed all doubt, calling it a voice of truth from a place of unimaginable terror. He addressed Isabella's deception directly. "You built a fortress of lies, believing your intellect would allow you to commit the perfect murder. But you were undone, not by a brilliant detective or a cunning prosecutor, but by a simple sound. The chime of a clock, a piece of your life that you brought with you to the scene of your crime, became the very thing that chained you to it forever." The judge then delivered the sentence, his words falling like hammer blows in the silent courtroom. "For the calculated, cruel, and remorseless murder of Julian Croft, this court sentences you to the maximum penalty allowed by the Commonwealth of Virginia, life in prison without the possibility of parole." At the word life, Isabella's body gave an involuntary flinch, the first uncontrolled movement she had made in the entire process. The finality of the sentence, the absolute and inescapable reality of her fate, had finally broken through her armor of arrogance. Two bailiffs moved to stand behind her, and as one gently touched her elbow to guide her to her feet, Isabella's composure finally and completely disintegrated. The cold void in her eyes erupted into a flash of pure, feral rage. She turned her head and stared at Elias Vance, her face contorted in a mask of hatred. Her battle of wits was over, the game was lost, and all that remained was the ugly, pathetic reality of her defeat. As the bailiffs led her from the courtroom, her confident stride was gone, replaced by the shuffling, defeated gait of a prisoner, the echo of a cuckoo clock chime following her into a lifetime of silence.